Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
The air in the hospital room seemed to thicken as the doctor's words fell into the silence. For a moment, time stood still. Jason Morgan, a man who had faced bullets, betrayals, mob wars, and near-death experiences countless times, now found himself confronted with something far more terrifying than any enemy he had ever encountered. The doctor's voice had been calm, professional, but the words carried a weight that no one in the room was prepared for. Jason had cancer, and it was advanced. The disease was spreading faster than anyone had realized, and the prognosis was grim. The strength that had always defined him seemed to waver for the first time as the reality of his condition sank in. He had always been the one to protect others, the one who shielded those he loved from danger, but now he was powerless against the very enemy that had taken root inside his own body. His mind raced, not with fear for himself, but for the people who depended on him. What would happen to Sam, to Danny, to all the people whose lives he had touched, once he was gone? Sam's breath caught in her throat as she tried to absorb what she was hearing. She had walked into that hospital room expecting updates about Jason's recovery from recent injuries, never imagining that she would be blindsided by something far worse. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, trying to remain strong for Jason's sake. Yet deep inside, she felt as if her world had just shattered into a million pieces. Jason had been her rock, her safe place through storms, and now she was being told that she would lose him to something she couldn't fight or negotiate with. It wasn't a rival mob family or a criminal scheme this time. It was cancer, merciless, unrelenting, and indifferent to the strength of the man it was consuming. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly, hoping he could feel how much she needed him to keep fighting, even as her heart silently broke. Carly's reaction was explosive in her own way. The news hit her like a truck, and she refused to accept it. "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "There has to be another test. Another doctor. You can't just sit there and tell us Jason is dying like it's already decided." Carly's voice rose, her anger masking the fear that clawed at her insides. Jason wasn't just her best friend, he was the one constant in her chaotic life, the man who had stood by her through every bad decision, every heartbreak, every crisis. The idea of a world without Jason was unimaginable, and her instinct was to fight it, to challenge the diagnosis as though sheer willpower could undo it. She leaned closer to the doctor, demanding answers, demanding options, while Jason sat quietly, his face unreadable, processing the gravity of what was happening. Inside, Jason wasn't as calm as he appeared. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't something he could shoot, outsmart, or overpower. It was an invisible enemy eating away at him from the inside, and the thought of leaving his children without a father tore at his soul. Danny was still young, still needing guidance, protection, and a father's love. And Jason thought of Jake, the son he had struggled to be present for, the boy who had already endured so much loss. The thought that he might add another wound to his children's hearts was unbearable. His hands trembled slightly, something they never did in the face of violence or danger, because now the fight wasn't on his terms. This was a battle where he didn't know the rules, and the enemy had the upper hand. Elizabeth's entrance into the room brought another wave of emotions. She had heard whispers, sensed the tension, and when she saw Jason's expression, her heart dropped. Elizabeth had shared a complicated history with Jason, one filled with love, heartbreak, and missed chances, but deep down she had always cared for him in ways she never fully let go of. Hearing that he was dying struck her to the core, not just for her own pain but for Jake's. Their son had already lost so much in his short life, and to think of him losing his father permanently felt unbearable. She rushed to Jason's side, her voice trembling as she asked the doctor about possible treatments, clinical trials, anything that might offer hope. Elizabeth wasn't ready to let her son face that kind of pain, and she wasn't ready to accept a future where Jason no longer existed in their lives. The room was thick with grief, fear, and the beginnings of desperate bargaining. Monica Quartermain, Jason's adoptive mother, tried to steady herself as she processed the blow. She had lost Alan, AJ, and so many members of her family already. The Quartermain house had become synonymous with tragedy, but she had always clung to the hope that Jason would survive, that his resilience would somehow allow him to outlast the darkness that surrounded their family name. As a doctor herself, she knew the harsh truth of the situation, but as a mother, her heart refused to accept it. She stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady, offering her son the comfort he desperately needed even if he wouldn't admit it. "We'll fight this," she whispered, though part of her feared they might not win this time. Sonny Corinthos stood in the corner of the hospital room, silent at first, but his silence was deafening. Sonny was a man who had stared down death countless times, who had ordered hits, defended his empire, and lost people he loved along the way. But Jason had never been one of them. Jason had been the constant, the right hand, the friend who never faltered even when Sonny himself was at his lowest. Now, faced with the reality that Jason was slipping away not because of an enemy but because of an illness, Sonny felt powerless. His world revolved around loyalty, strength, and control, and none of those things could stop what was happening inside Jason's body. His mind began racing for answers, searching for specialists, for connections, for anyone who might be able to change the outcome. But deep down, even Sonny knew that this was not a fight the mob could fix. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened, and still he said nothing, because words would not come. Sonny's heart was breaking in a way he didn't know how to put into words. Sam's grip on Jason's hand tightened as if by holding on hard enough she could keep him tethered to life. She wanted to scream, to demand that the doctors find a miracle, to run away from the sterile smell of the hospital that suddenly felt like a prison. But when she looked into Jason's eyes, she saw the acceptance there, the way he was already beginning to shoulder the burden quietly, like he always did. That look scared her more than anything, because it told her Jason wasn't going to fight for himself, he was going to fight for everyone else. He would endure treatments, pain, anything they asked of him, not because he believed he could survive, but because he couldn't bear to hurt the people he loved by giving up. And that terrified her. "You're not leaving me," Sam whispered, tears streaming down her face despite her efforts to stay composed. "We'll figure this out. We always do." Jason didn't answer right away, and his silence cut her deeper than words ever could. In another part of the hospital, word had begun to spread. General Hospital was no stranger to tragedy, but Jason's diagnosis carried a weight that rippled through the entire building. Nurses whispered, orderlies shook their heads in disbelief, and staff who had treated him after countless injuries over the years couldn't quite believe this was how his story might end. Epiphany Johnson, who had always respected Jason even if she didn't approve of all his choices, paused outside the room, her hand pressed against the doorframe. She had seen death too many times in this hospital, but there was something about Jason, something about the quiet strength he carried, that made this feel particularly cruel. She closed her eyes for a moment, sending up a silent prayer, before continuing down the hall with tears brimming in her eyes. Meanwhile, back in the room, Carly refused to stop fighting. "We're not just going to sit here," she snapped at the doctor. "You'll find another treatment. There are trials, experimental therapies. I don't care what it costs or where we have to go, Jason is not dying. Not like this." Her voice trembled, betraying the fear beneath her fury. She turned back to Jason, her expression softening for just a moment. "You've saved me more times than I can count," she whispered. "You don't get to leave me now. Not when I still need you." Jason looked at her, at Sam, at Elizabeth, at Monica, at all the people gathered who were waiting for him to promise them something he couldn't. His instinct was to reassure them, to shoulder the weight, but for once he didn't know if he could. Elizabeth brushed tears from her cheeks as she thought about Jake. She would have to tell their son. She would have to sit him down and explain that his father, the man he had only recently begun to build a relationship with, might not be there much longer. The idea shattered her. Jason had missed so many years with Jake, not by choice, but by circumstances out of their control. And now, just when they had begun to heal those wounds, time was being stolen from them again. "You can't leave him," Elizabeth said softly, her voice breaking. "He needs you, Jason. He still needs his father." Jason met her eyes, and though he didn't speak, the pain in his expression was answer enough. The weight of the room pressed down on everyone until it was hard to breathe. Sonny finally stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "We're not giving up. I don't care what the doctors say. I'll find someone. There's always another option." His words carried conviction, but there was a hint of desperation behind them. He wasn't just talking about doctors or treatments, he was talking about refusing to let go of the one person who had stood beside him through everything. "You're not going anywhere," Sunny said directly to Jason. "Not on my watch." Jason gave him a small nod, but his eyes betrayed the truth. Some battles couldn't be won no matter how much willpower or loyalty was thrown at them. The doctor quietly excused himself, leaving the group to grapple with the news in their own way. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of muffled sobs and the distant beeping of hospital machines. Jason leaned back against the bed, closing his eyes for a moment. He wasn't afraid of dying, he never had been. But the thought of leaving behind the people he loved, the thought of not being there when they needed him most, was the one thing he couldn't reconcile. He opened his eyes again, forcing strength into his voice even as his body trembled with exhaustion. "I'll fight," he said finally, looking at each of them in turn. "For all of you. I'll fight." The words, when they came, did not initially register as language. They were a physical force, a concussive wave that entered the room ahead of the doctor himself, a man named Dr. Evans, whom Jason had known for years in the context of routine physicals and minor sports injuries. Dr. Evans was a compact, balding man with kind eyes and a perpetual air of calm competence. Today, the calm was still there, but it was the terrible, hollow calm of a deep freeze. He moved into the private consultation room where Jason sat with his wife, Sarah, his movements precise and economical, as if conserving energy for a task that required every joule of his professional resolve. He did not sit behind the large, imposing oak desk. Instead, he pulled a smaller chair around to face them, his knees almost touching theirs. The gesture was so intimate, so deliberately counter to the usual hierarchy of the space, that a cold dread, sharper and more focused than the general anxiety that had plagued them for weeks, began to crystallize in Jason's stomach. Sarah's hand, which had been resting in his, tightened its grip, her knuckles pressing white against his skin. "Jason, Sarah," Dr. Evans began, his voice low and even, devoid of the reassuring lilt it usually carried. "I've received the full results from the biopsy and the subsequent scans. I'm afraid the news is not what we were hoping for." He paused, allowing the preamble to settle. It was a professional courtesy, a warning shot across the bow of their reality. Jason's mind, which had been cycling through 100 different, manageable possibilities, a stubborn infection, a rare but treatable autoimmune disorder, a benign growth requiring a simple procedure, suddenly went blank and silent. The room seemed to tilt, the muted landscape painting on the wall behind the doctor sliding slightly out of true. "The pathology confirms a diagnosis of glioblastoma multiforme," Dr. Evans said, the words sounding foreign and grotesque. "It's a very aggressive form of brain cancer. The tumor is located in the thalamus, a deep and critical structure. Its position makes surgical intervention impossible." The word cancer landed first, a heavy, ugly stone dropped into the still pond of their lives. It sent out ripples of pure, unadulterated fear. But it was the next part, the clinical, devastating follow-up, that truly shattered the world. "Inoperable." Jason heard a small, sharp intake of breath from Sarah, a sound like a pane of glass cracking. What does that mean, exactly?" Jason heard himself ask. His own voice sounded distant, as if it were coming from another room. "There are other treatments, though." "Radiation? Chemotherapy?" Dr. Evans's gaze was unwavering, filled with a profound and sorrowful honesty. "We will, of course, discuss all palliative treatment options. Aggressive radiation and a specific chemotherapy regimen can be attempted. The goal of these treatments would be to try to shrink the tumor, to alleviate symptoms, and to buy time." The phrase "buy time" hung in the air, its meaning both clear and utterly incomprehensible. It was a transactional term, but no one was stating the currency or the price. "How much time?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling so violently the words barely cohered. Dr. Evans looked down at his hands for a moment, then back at them. "With aggressive treatment, we're looking at a prognosis of 6 to 9 months. Perhaps a year. Without treatment, significantly less. 6 to 9 months. The words were simple, a sequence of numbers and a unit of measurement. Yet, they failed to map onto Jason's understanding of his own existence. He was 42 years old. He had a 5-year-old daughter, Chloe, who believed he was the strongest man in the world. He had a mortgage, a vacation planned for next summer, a half-finished model ship in the garage. He had a life. A future. 6 to 9 months was not a future, it was a sentence. It was the space between now and the end of the school year. It was the time it took to grow a decent tomato plant. It was nothing. It was an abyss. The rest of the meeting was a blur, a torrent of information delivered in Dr. Evans's careful, measured tones that crashed against the sudden deafness of Jason's shock. He heard fragments: focal neurological deficits, seizure management, steroids to reduce swelling, quality of life, hospice care. Each term was a brick being laid in the wall that was now closing him off from the world of the well, the world of the living. He nodded at appropriate intervals, a mechanical response devoid of comprehension. Sarah was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a crumpled tissue, her body shaking with the effort of containing her sobs. The walk out of the hospital was surreal. The fluorescent lights hummed the same tune they always had. The linoleum floor gleamed with the same waxy shine. People moved through the corridors with purpose, nurses pushing carts, visitors carrying balloons, patients in wheelchairs, all of them part of a functioning ecosystem from which he had just been violently expelled. He was engrossed among them, a man already half gone, carrying a death sentence in a manila folder clutched in his numb hand. The car ride home was conducted in a silence so profound it was a physical presence in the vehicle. It was not a peaceful silence, but a thick, heavy blanket of shock and dread. Jason stared out the window at the passing world, a man mowing his lawn, kids playing in a sprinkler, a couple arguing on a sidewalk. Their lives, their mundane, beautiful, trivial problems, seemed to exist in a separate dimension, one of blissful ignorance and infinite possibility. He felt a bizarre and sudden envy for the man mowing the lawn, for the sheer, uncomplicated burden of his task. When they arrived home, the house felt different. It was no longer just a house, it was a container for a finite number of moments. The swing set in the backyard, where he pushed Chloe for hours, was no longer a piece of playground equipment, it was a monument to a future he would not see. The photographs on the walls were not memories, they were artifacts from a lost civilization. Sarah went straight to the bathroom and turned on the shower, and he knew she was in there, the water masking the sound of her weeping, trying to hold herself together for what came next. What came next was Chloe, bursting through the door later that afternoon, dropped off by his mother. She was a whirlwind of pink overalls and flyaway blonde hair, her small backpack trailing behind her. "Daddy! Daddy! Grandma, let me have ice cream," she yelled, launching herself at his legs. Jason knelt down, the movement feeling stiff and unnatural, and gathered her into his arms. He buried his face in the sweet, sweaty scent of her hair, and for the first time since Dr. Evans had spoken, the dam within him broke. He did not cry, but a wave of such visceral, physical agony washed over him that he thought he might be sick. This small, perfect human, whose entire universe was still so safe and so small, had no idea that its center was about to collapse. "I love you, Chloe Bug," he whispered, his voice thick and strange. "I love you too, Daddy," she said, squirming out of his grasp, already bored with the unusual intensity of the hug. "Can we watch a movie?" That evening, after Chloe was finally asleep, the reality of their situation descended upon the living room with the weight of a collapsing star. Jason and Sarah sat on the sofa, a bottle of wine open between them, though neither had taken more than a sip. The manila folder lay on the coffee table like an accusation. "We have to tell people," Sarah said, her voice raw. "Our parents. My sister. We can't carry this alone." Jason nodded mutely. The thought of articulating the words to his aging parents, of watching the light in his father's eyes dim with the news, was a fresh kind of torture. "And we have to fight this, Jason," she continued, a desperate fierceness entering her tone. "Dr. Evans doesn't know everything. There are new trials. Experimental treatments. We'll go to the Mayo Clinic, to MD Anderson. We'll sell the house if we have to." He looked at her, at the fierce love and determination etched on her beautiful, tear-streaked face, and his heart broke all over again. Her hope was aflame in the overwhelming darkness, and he felt a crushing responsibility to tend to it even as his own felt utterly extinguished. He reached out and took her hand. Okay, he said, the word a hollow concession. We'll fight. And so, the new reality began to take shape. It was a reality governed by calendars and pill organizers, by the stark, sterile language of oncology. The following weeks were a whirlwind of second and third opinions, each one confirming Dr. Evans's grim prognosis with minor variations in the estimated timeline. They traveled to a renowned cancer center in another state, where a team of brilliant, white-coated strangers pored over his scans with furrowed brows, using words like infiltration and mitotic index, before gently, regretfully, echoing the same hopeless message. The tumor was too deep, too entwined with the very core of what made him him. Surgery was a guaranteed catastrophe. The available treatments were, at best, a delaying action. They chose a course of aggressive radiation combined with a chemotherapy drug called temozolomide. The side effects were brutal. The radiation left him with a constant, pounding headache and patches of hair loss that made him flinch every time he caught his reflection. The chemotherapy brought waves of nausea so profound he would spend hours curled on the bathroom floor, shivering and sweating, the taste of metal permanently coating his tongue. The steroids he took to control the brain swelling made his face puffy and moon-like, and threw his emotions into a chaotic tumult. He would be seized by irrational anger over a misplaced remote control, then dissolve into helpless tears during a television commercial. Through it all, he tried to maintain a facade for Chloe. He forced himself to get down on the floor and play with her, even when the movement sent stabbing pains through his skull. He read her bedtime stories, his voice sometimes slurring slightly from the fatigue and the medications. He became an actor in the play of his own life, performing the role of daddy while the real Jason was being systematically dismantled from the inside out. The people in their lives reacted in a spectrum of ways that was both predictable and endlessly surprising. Sarah's sister, Melissa, became their logistical rock, organizing meal trains, taking Chloe for sleepovers, and handling the flood of well-meaning but overwhelming messages from friends and acquaintances. Jason's best friend, Mark, a jovial man who had been his college roommate, initially responded with bluster and denial, insisting there had to be a mistake. Talking about a shaman he'd read about online. But as the physical evidence of Jason's illness became impossible to ignore, Mark's bravado faded, replaced by a quiet, steadfast presence. He would come over and simply sit with Jason, sometimes not speaking for hours, just watching a game, his silent solidarity a greater comfort than any words of encouragement. His parents were devastated. His mother, in particular, seemed to age a decade in the space of a week. She fussed over him, bringing him food he couldn't eat and rearranging blankets he didn't need, her love manifesting as a frantic, helpless energy. His father, a stoic, retired engineer, retreated into a shell of quiet grief. He would grip Jason's shoulder too tightly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, unable to find the words to articulate a loss that was, for a parent, fundamentally unnatural. And then there were the others, the acquaintances whose discomfort led them to offer platitudes that felt like salt in a wound. Everything happens for a reason, one said. Stay positive, urged another. Jason learned to smile and nod, to accept the casseroles and the prayers, all the while screaming silently inside. What reason could possibly justify this? What positivity could possibly stand against the microscopic army laying waste to his brain? As the first cycle of treatment ended and a brief period of recovery began, Jason found his world shrinking. The fatigue was a constant companion, a leaden weight in his bones. He had to stop driving after a minor episode of confusion at a stop sign. His work, a career in graphic design he had loved and built over 20 years, became an impossible memory. The company held his job for him, officially, but everyone knew he was never coming back. His relationship with Sarah began to change, to fracture under the immense, unrelenting pressure. She was his primary caregiver, his advocate, his nurse. She managed his medications, tracked his symptoms, and spoke to the doctors when he was too tired or too foggy to form the questions himself. The dynamic of their marriage, once a partnership of equals, had shifted into one of patient and caretaker. The easy intimacy, the shared jokes, the simple act of talking about their days, it all receded, replaced by the clinical minutiae of his decline. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the grief she was constantly suppressing to be strong for him, and he felt a gnawing guilt for the burden he had become. One night, about 4 months into the diagnosis, he woke to find her side of the bed empty. He found her in the living room, sitting in the dark, her body racked with silent sobs. He stood in the doorway, watching her, his heart aching with a love that was now inextricably tangled with pity and a profound sense of loss. He was losing her, too, not to death, but to the slow, grinding process of his dying. "I'm sorry," he whispered from the doorway. She started, turning her tear-streaked face toward him. "Don't," she said, her voice cracking. "Don't you dare apologize for this, Jason. This is not your fault. But I'm ruining your life. I'm ruining Chloe's life." She stood up and crossed the room, wrapping her arms around him. He could feel the sharp protrusion of her shoulder blades, the weight she had lost worrying over him. "You are my life," she said fiercely. "And we are going to get through this. Every second we have, we get through it together." But the togetherness was becoming more difficult to sustain. The tumor was beginning to assert its presence in more sinister ways. He started having brief, unsettling lapses in memory. He would forget a close friend's name mid-conversation. He would get lost driving to the grocery store he'd been going to for years. One afternoon, he was building a Lego castle with Chloe and suddenly couldn't remember what the colorful plastic bricks were called. He just stared at them, a cold terror seizing him as his daughter looked up at him, her small face creased with confusion. "Daddy? What's wrong?" These cognitive thefts were, in some ways, more frightening than the physical pain. They were direct assaults on his identity, proof that the invader was not just occupying space in his head, but was actively dismantling the man he was. The 6-month mark arrived, coinciding with a follow-up MRI. The scan showed what Dr. Evans, with his devastating honesty, called modest initial response followed by significant progression. The tumor had shrunk slightly under the initial assault of radiation and chemo, but it had since regrown, more aggressive than before. It was developing new blood vessels, a process he called angiogenesis, feeding itself, strengthening its hold. The treatment options were dwindling. They could try a different, more toxic chemotherapy regimen, with a low chance of success and a high chance of making the time he had left miserable. Or, they could stop aggressive treatment and focus entirely on palliative care, managing the pain, the seizures, the swelling, to ensure the highest possible quality for whatever life remained. It was during this meeting, as Dr. Evans laid out this brutal choice, that Jason experienced a moment of strange, crystalline clarity. He looked at Sarah, saw the hope in her eyes warring with the dawning acceptance of the inevitable. He thought of Chloe, of the last few months he had spent in a chemo-induced haze, too sick to truly be present with her. He thought of the man he used to be, the man who loved hiking, who could fix anything, who made his wife laugh until she cried, and he realized that man was already mostly gone, replaced by this pale, puffy, faltering shell. "I'm done," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Sarah whipped her head toward him. "Jason, no. There's still the clinical trial in Boston we read about. We can." "No, Sarah," he interrupted, turning to look at her directly. He took her hand. "I'm done fighting. I'm so tired. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left being poisoned. I want to be here. With you. With Chloe. I want to feel the sun on my face. I want to taste my food. I want to read her one more story, and remember it." The silence in the room was absolute. Dr. Evans simply nodded, a look of deep, professional respect in his eyes. Sarah stared at him, and he watched as the fierce, fighting hope in her eyes finally, reluctantly, gave way to a heartbroken, loving surrender. She squeezed his hand and gave a single, shaky nod. The transition to hospice care was, paradoxically, a liberation. The frantic, desperate energy of the fight was gone, replaced by a grim, peaceful acceptance. A hospice nurse named Eleanor, a woman with a bottomless well of compassion and a no-nonsense demeanor, became a regular presence in their home. She managed his medications with expert precision, keeping the pain and the headaches at bay without rendering him completely insensate. She talked to him not as a patient, but as a man, about his life, his work, his family. With the fog of aggressive treatment lifting, Jason experienced a period of relative wellness, a final, gentle plateau before the inevitable descent. He and Sarah started having real conversations again, not about treatments or symptoms, but about their lives together. They looked through old photo albums, laughing at memories of their backpacking trip through Europe, their chaotic wedding day, the moment Chloe was born. They talked about the future, about what he wanted for her, for Sarah.